So this poster is motivated by recognizing in food systems debates about sustainable food, there are two primary sides. One is environmental purists who are trying to encourage organic food and heirloom food and permaculture and biodiversity and just environmental preservation overall. And the other side is technological optimists who argue that in order to feed the world, we are going to need to make some sacrifices, make more efficient food, and close yield gaps. And if that means genetic modification, that's just one of the many tools that are necessary to bring about a sustainable food system, with the idea that a sustainable food system is one that can actually feed us all.
So could you go into more detail about the methods you use to research this further?
One of the arguments I make is that consumers are confused by these two sides, so they need methods to figure out which side has a valid point. One of these methods is life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is a method to evaluate the environmental impacts of a given system from cradle to grave. And I found that there is a significant amount of food LCA literature, but most of it is very simplified. So one of the things that I want to do as part of this research is contribute to that literature with more sophisticated food LCA.
So it looks like you have two different ways that your research went. Could you go into more detail about these different methods?
So I explained a little bit about the food LCA, but LCA can only help consumers so much because it's time intensive and resource intensive to complete, and you can't possibly do an LCA of everything. Also, LCA only gets at the environmental aspects of food, and consumers are concerned with quite a bit more than just that. And it's very efficiency oriented. So it kind of favors technological optimists. So to balance it, I think the consumers need to have conceptual understanding of some of the relevant concepts. So that includes LCA, but it also includes things like biotechnology, psychology, cooking, critical thinking, and economics. I think that consumers need training for sustainable consumption, but they don't need full-blown expertise. A way to evaluate the effectiveness of training programs is this Turinx test that I developed. This is the test of ubiquitous through real or interactional expertise. And what that means is that it tests what level of expertise a consumer has. Do they have none? Do they have some? Or can they pass themselves off as a full expert? And through questions testing the tacit knowledge of consumers, we can evaluate how effective these training programs are.
So what were some major results that you got from the Turnex as well as the LCA portion of your research?
Both of these are preliminary results, but from Turnex, I evaluated how well vegans, vegetarians, and omnivores are able to pretend to be vegans. In the case of vegans, they're not pretending. In these results, I found that vegans were more effective at convincing judges that they actually are vegan than vegetarians and omnivores. And a somewhat surprising conclusion was that vegetarians and omnivores were exactly as effective as each other in convincing the judges that they were vegan. The LCA results are basic preliminary results focusing on a comparison between soybean meal and chicken. I mentioned earlier that I'm interested in contributing to the food LCA literature by analyzing more sophisticated food products, and the one that I've chosen is soy protein isolate. The reason for this is that it's a common ingredient in most fake meats, and soybean meal is one of the main components of it. So preliminary results show that soybean meal is significantly less environmentally intensive than any type of chicken, standard, free range, or organic. But the research that needs to be done now is figuring out how processing that soybean meal into soy protein isolate, affects that environmental profile. Does it actually make it worse than the other options?
I am interested in this chart in particular. Could you tell me more about that?
Sure. This is an overview of food LCA literature demonstrating what I said earlier about food LCA being focused on simple products. If you notice the different colors, green circles represent food for which LCA data exists, whereas blue circles represent food where LCA data doesn't exist. And this graph shows impacts from ecological inputs and processes on the x-axis and impacts from industrial inputs and processes on the y-axis. So this is a conceptual graph showing that environmental impacts can come both from farming and from processing. And a lot of the impacts that are accounted for in food LCA come from these farm-level processes. And the more sophisticated a product gets, the more likely it is that industrial processes are causing impacts. And most of those are not being captured because these foods are not being assessed.
Okay, so if there would be one takeaway from anyone, looking at your poster, interested in your poster, what would that be?
I think that the main takeaway I'd like someone to get from this poster is that in order for consumers to be sustainable consumers, they need to be informed. And that involves more than just having the latest LCA data. It means having a basic understanding and competence in all of the relevant fields for sustainable consumption.